It started with a jacket, a sleeping mother, a crying child, and a single dad who didn't look away when most people would. He offered warmth without asking a name, and what happened next would change everything he thought he knew about love loss and second chances. If stories like this speak to your heart, consider subscribing. We share moments that remind us all kindness still matters. Now let me tell you what really happened in the quietest row on that flight. Sawyer Langley had never been fond of airports, not because of the lines or the noise or the coffee that always tasted like burnt plastic, but because they were full of goodbyes. And Sawyer had already said enough of those to last a lifetime. He walked beside his daughter through the concourse of the small regional terminal, their steps quiet in the early morning stillness. Maggie, all of 7 years old with wide eyes and soft curls tucked behind her ears, clutched her stuffed deer and walked with the cautious focus of a child trying to be braver than she felt. Their flight to Denver would be short, just under 2 hours, but for Sawyer it carried weight. He was taking Maggie to a follow-up neurology appointment, another piece of the long, slow healing from the accident that took her mother and left Maggie with shadows in her eyes she didn't know how to name. And maybe if he was honest, shadows in his own heart that had never quite lifted either. "Gate B," he murmured, glancing at the ticket. He didn't care much for assigned seats, but he always requested the back row when traveling with Maggie. It was quieter, less crowded, and something about being behind everyone else felt easier, like you weren't in the way. As they approached the gate, Maggie tugged his coat sleeve. "Dad," she whispered, "can we sit by the window?" He smiled and nodded. "You've got it." When they boarded, the row was almost empty, except for a young woman, already seated by the aisle, cradling a sleeping toddler against her chest. Her dark blonde hair was tied back, loosely wisps, falling into her face. Her eyes, shadowed with fatigue, lifted briefly as Sawyer and Maggie arrived. "Sorry," she said softly, adjusting her baby. "If you want the aisle, I can." "No need," Sawyer replied. "We're happy with the window." They shuffled in Maggie, taking the window seat, Sawyer settling between her and the woman. He noted the swell of her belly, not obvious at first glance, but unmistakable now that he saw her face. Pregnant, and traveling alone with a toddler. That was a different kind of strength. The woman leaned back, sighing almost imperceptibly. The toddler stirred in her arms, whimpered, and then settled again. She looked at Sawyer, apologetic. "Long night?" he asked gently. She nodded. "We missed a connection. This was the earliest flight I could find." He didn't sleep at all in the terminal. Sawyer didn't pry. He just gave her a small nod, then turned to Maggie, who was staring out the window as the tarmac crew loaded baggage. The cabin filled slowly, mostly with business travelers and a few older couples. No one paid attention to their row tucked away in the rear, as always. As the plane took off, the soft roar of engines became a lullaby. Maggie leaned her head against his shoulder, eyelids fluttering. Sawyer let himself breathe, just for a moment. And then the baby woke up. It started with a whimper, high-pitched, soft. Then it grew into a cry. The woman opened her eyes with a start, whispering comfort, but the child twisted in her arms, inconsolable. She bounced him lightly, whispering "shh" over and over, but it was no use. Passengers in the row ahead shifted. Someone sighed audibly. Sawyer reached into Maggie's small backpack and pulled out a soft cloth deer brown with worn ears and stitched eyes. He tapped the baby's arm with it lightly. The child blinked, hiccuped between cries, and reached for it. The woman looked stunned. "It's clean," Sawyer said with a small smile. "My daughter's idea. She says every baby should have a forest friend." The baby clutched the deer, holding it to his face. The crying stopped. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Sawyer just nodded. Glad it worked. A few moments later, the woman leaned her head back again. Her breathing deepened. She had fallen asleep before she could say anything more. Sawyer looked over. The baby, still clutching the deer, had also drifted off. His chubby cheek rested against his mother's arm. She held him securely even in sleep. And just like that, the row fell into silence. Sawyer removed his jacket, and without thinking much of it, laid it gently over them both. Maggie watched, sleepy-eyed, from beside him. "Is she cold?" she whispered. "I think so," he answered softly. Maggie looked at the woman's face for a long moment. "She looks tired like you did last year." Sawyer's throat tightened, but he said nothing. "She'll be okay," Maggie said, curling back into his side. "She has the deer now." He glanced at the two sleeping figures beside him. The jacket shifted slightly with their breath. A moment of stillness, of fragile, borrowed peace. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But something about the way her arms cradled the baby, and the way she slept, as if this flight were the first safe place she'd found in months, made him feel like maybe they were all flying toward something more than just Denver. Sawyer wasn't asleep, but he let his eyes close. The low rumble of the engines, the rhythmic hiss of recycled air, and Maggie's slow, even breathing beside him, it was a lullaby of sorts. Not peace exactly, but quiet. And in Sawyer's world, quiet was sacred. Then somewhere in that fragile stillness, the baby stirred. Sawyer opened one eye. The boy squirmed beneath the jacket, his tiny fists clenching. A soft, uncertain whimper escaped his mouth. Ellie, he still didn't know her name. Not yet, remained asleep, her head tilted at an awkward angle, mouth slightly open. Breath shallow but steady. The whimper rose again, louder this time, with that telltale edge of panic. The kind Sawyer recognized. Not a cry for attention, but the sound of a child too tired to self-soothe and too overwhelmed to stop. Sawyer shifted slightly, careful not to wake Maggie. He reached for the baby's deer, the soft cloth toy Maggie had once called Bucky, and held it near the child's face. For a moment it worked. The boy blinked, clutched at the toy, and paused. Then all at once he let out a sharp wail. Ellie jerked awake with a gasp, confused and breathless. It took her a second to register where she was, then another to realize the baby was crying in her arms. She sat upright too quickly, wincing, one hand on her belly. "Shh, shh, I'm sorry," she whispered, rocking him, eyes darting around the cabin, dreading the stares she knew were coming. Sawyer was already moving. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She didn't look at him. "Yes." "No." "I don't know," she murmured. Her voice was raw. "He gets like this sometimes." "I must have been more tired than I thought. I didn't mean to fall asleep. No one's blaming you," he said gently. But the baby was in full protest now. Back-arched fists, flying face red. His tiny legs kicked with surprising force. Ellie tried bouncing him, but her face twisted in pain. She gritted her teeth, hand going to her calf. Sawyer caught the movement. "Cramp?" he asked. "Yeah," she hissed. "Left leg." "Bad." Sawyer reached down without hesitation. "May I?" he asked, already kneeling in the cramped space between the seats. She blinked at him. "What?" "Let me help. I've done this 100 times." Are you a doctor?" was he said. "Field medic." "Army." "I'm a carpenter now." He offered a faint smile. "But muscle is muscle." She nodded weakly. Sawyer placed one hand on her knee and the other under her calf. With practiced movements, he extended her leg gently but firmly. She winced, but didn't pull away. Then he pressed 2 fingers into the belly of her calf muscle and began to massage in slow, circular motions. "Try to breathe with me," he said, his voice low and even. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." She did. The baby, momentarily distracted, stared up at Sawyer with wide, watery eyes. "You've done this before," she managed. He nodded. "My wife." Used to get them bad, especially during the last trimester. There was a pause. She looked at him, then really looked at him. And for the first time, Sawyer saw the weariness behind her eyes shift, not vanish, but soften. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He didn't ask why. Some things didn't need explanation. The cramp passed. Slowly, she relaxed her grip on the seat in front of her. Her body eased back into the chair. The baby, sensing her calm, let out one last hiccup of protest, and then nestled against her shoulder, with the deer pressed to his cheek. She sighed. "I don't know your name." "Sawyer." "I'm Ellie." They shook hands quietly, like two people sharing a trench. A flight attendant passed by with a weary smile, oblivious to the small drama that had just unfolded in row 29. The world outside the airplane windows was white and clouded, endless sky stretching in all directions. But in the quiet row at the back, something was slowly warming. Ellie adjusted the jacket draped over her shoulder. "You're kind," she said softly. "That's not common these days." Sawyer glanced at Maggie, still sleeping. "I try to be who I want her to remember." Ellie followed his gaze. "She's sweet. Brave, too. Most kids her age would have cried just hearing my boy scream." "She's been through a lot," Sawyer said. "She doesn't cry easily anymore." Ellie turned toward him. "I'm sorry." He nodded, eyes fixed forward. "Me too." For a while, neither spoke. The baby slept. The hum of the aircraft surrounded them like a shell. And in that quiet, something unnamed passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but something that would stay. Something that would return. The moment passed when Maggie stirred, blinking herself awake and reaching for Sawyer's hand. He squeezed her fingers gently. Ellie watched them for a moment, then whispered, "Thank you. For all of it." Sawyer looked over. "You're welcome. But I think it's Bucky who saved the day." Ellie smiled. It was small and tired and a little crooked, but it was real. And that was the first real smile Sawyer had seen from a stranger in a long time. The hum of the engines never changed, but the atmosphere in row 29 had shifted. Sawyer sat upright again, adjusting Maggie's blanket as she nestled into his side. Her eyes were open now, but glazed in that dreamy halfway place between sleep and waking. He brushed a lock of hair from her forehead, and she gave him a drowsy smile. "She's nice," Maggie murmured, nodding toward Ellie. "And her baby smells like oatmeal." Sawyer chuckled softly. "That's probably a compliment." Ellie looked over, still cradling the now sleeping child, who clutched the cloth deer with a sleepy possessiveness that made Maggie beam with pride. "That toy." "It's yours," Ellie asked gently. Maggie nodded. "His name's Bucky. He was mine when I was little." "You're still little," Sawyer said, but there was no correction in his tone, only warmth. "I'm big enough to give things away," she replied solemnly, and Ellie blinked at the quiet bravery in that statement. Sawyer's eyes lingered on his daughter a moment longer before turning back to Ellie. "How far along are you?" he asked. 27 weeks, she said, then hesitated. "And exhausted. Flying solo with a toddler and one on the way. That's more than most people could handle." She gave a faint shrug, almost embarrassed. "You do what you have to." Sawyer nodded. "You do." There was a pause. Not awkward, just full. Like two people walking across a bridge they didn't know they'd built. Then Ellie shifted, adjusting her legs, and the motion triggered something. A tight breath, a wince, a hand clamping down on her lower abdomen. Sawyer sat forward immediately. Another cramp. "No," she said quickly, but her voice shook. "Just stretching, I think." "Ligaments." Sawyer watched her for a beat. Her jaw was clenched, her eyes damp again, not with panic, but with pressure. She was holding herself together by threads. He reached into the seat pocket and pulled out a small water bottle, handing it to her. Hydrate. Helps with cramps and the ligament pain. Magnesium, too, if you've got it. She accepted the bottle with both hands. You really were a medic, weren't you? 18 years, he said. Then 3 more as a trauma tech before I walked away. Why Sawyer didn't answer right away. He looked out the window beside Maggie where clouds hung like silent mountains. Too much holding broken people together when you couldn't fix the ones who mattered, he said quietly. Ellie didn't reply. She just held the bottle tighter. A few moments passed in silence, filled only by the occasional click of a seatbelt or the murmur of the captain overhead. Then Ellie whispered, "Was it your wife?" Sawyer nodded. "Car accident. 2 years ago last May. I'm sorry. She was kind," he said. "Not perfect. Not easy. But kind. And funny. The kind of person who couldn't sit still in a room where someone was hurting." Ellie swallowed. "Sounds like someone else I just met." Sawyer smiled faintly. "I just hand out stuffed deer. Doesn't count for much." "It counts," she said, her voice firmer than before. "Believe me." The baby stirred again, and Ellie rocked him gently, her hand running down his back with practiced calm. She looked older in that moment, not in years, but in wear, like someone who'd learned to carry more than she was meant to. Sawyer recognized the look. He saw it in the mirror every morning. "You managing on your own?" he asked, softer now. Ellie hesitated. "I have help. Some family. But not the kind you rely on for long. And not lately." He nodded, understanding without pressing. "I wasn't supposed to be on this flight," she added. "Missed my original one. Rerouted through here. Everything's been scrambled lately." Sawyer smiled. "Some of the best things in my life started with a missed connection." She tilted her head. "Like what?" He gestured to Maggie, who was now drawing on a napkin with a ballpoint pen. "Her. She wasn't planned, but she's the only thing that got me through." Ellie looked at the girl for a long, quiet moment. "I get that," she said. Outside, the clouds began to thin. A sliver of mountain range appeared far below, jagged and snow-dusted. The pilot's voice came overhead with the beginning of descent instructions. They were getting close. Sawyer sat back, feeling that strange sensation of return, the gravity of going somewhere you've been before, even if your heart hasn't quite caught up. Ellie turned to him once more. "Thank you," she said. "For helping. For seeing me. Most people look away when things get messy." Sawyer's reply was simple. "I don't look away anymore." She blinked. "Anymore I used to," he said. "I used to be afraid of broken things. Now I just try to hold them steady." Ellie's mouth parted as if she wanted to ask more, but the seatbelt light blinked on, and the baby stirred again, eyes fluttering open. As the plane began its slow descent, Sawyer adjusted his seatbelt, glancing one last time at the woman beside him. He still didn't know where her life was headed, but something told him this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Not by a long shot. The landing gear dropped with a dull thud beneath their feet, jolting Sawyer from a brief and uncharacteristic moment of calm. He glanced out the window. Denver below, gray and flat, ringed by snow-tipped mountains that stood like old soldiers at rest. Next to him, Maggie tightened her grip on the armrest. Flying didn't scare her, not exactly, but landings still made her quiet. "It's just like a big bump," Sawyer whispered. She nodded, but didn't answer. Her fingers remained curled tight. Sawyer placed his hand over hers and gave it a squeeze. "You're doing great." The plane descended through a final layer of clouds, the sun breaking through just enough to cast golden lines across the tops of heads and shoulders. In the quiet row, Ellie stirred beside him, her baby nestled warm and breathing against her chest. Bucky still clutched, in the child's small hand. Ellie blinked, slowly disoriented. Then her eyes drifted down to the jacket covering her. She froze. Sawyer didn't speak. He simply watched her reaction unfold, the confusion, the recognition, the soft rush of breath as she realized what he'd done. Her fingers traced the worn collar, olive green canvas military issue, edges frayed from years of wear. She turned to him with a look that was somehow both apologetic and deeply moved. "You covered us," she said. He nodded. "I didn't even notice. You were asleep. You needed it more." Her lips pressed into a trembling line. "That jacket, it smells like cedar. And something else. Old house and stronger coffee than I know how to make," he said, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ellie laughed too softly to disturb her child. "It's warm. That's the idea." She looked like she wanted to say more, but words were often poor substitutes for emotions too large to fit in sentences. Instead, she pulled the jacket tighter around her and rested her cheek briefly against it. "Thank you," she whispered. The plane touched down with a bounce and a long, shuddering exhale. The cabin erupted in the usual rustle of movement, seat belts clicking open overhead, bins creaking, passengers stretching stiff limbs and checking phones. But in row 29, no one moved. Sawyer waited. Maggie reached for her backpack, silent but composed. Ellie's baby stirred but didn't cry. When the aisle began to clear, Ellie stood shifting the baby against her hip. Sawyer reached to help her with the diaper bag, his movements practiced and gentle. "You've got that dad reflex," she said, watching him sling the bag over his shoulder. He smiled. "Comes from carrying too many snacks and not enough coffee." She chuckled, then glanced down at the jacket still wrapped around her shoulders. "I'll give this back," Sawyer stopped her. "Keep it." "Really? Are you sure it's just a jacket?" he said. "But maybe it's what you needed today." Ellie paused, visibly torn. Then she nodded. "Okay, but I'm returning it. Eventually." He raised a brow. "You planning to find me?" Her smile was slow, a little crooked. "You gave me your daughter's stuffed animal, and now your jacket. I think that makes us something like accidental friends." Sawyer looked over at Maggie, who was now standing hugging Bucky's twin, a newer, cleaner version of the deer that had gone to the baby. "She's going to want that toy back," he said lightly. "No," Maggie said from behind him, surprising them both. "He needs it more." Ellie blinked. "That's very kind of you." Maggie shrugged. "My dad says kindness is like peanut butter. It sticks." Sawyer laughed, a full, honest laugh that he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. "I did say that," he admitted. Didn't think she was listening. "I always listen," Maggie said with a grin. They exited the plane last, as they always didn't out of hesitation, but because the quiet suited them. At the jet bridge, Ellie adjusted her grip on her sleeping son. "Thank you again," she said, eyes locking on Sawyer's. "For everything." He gave a modest nod. "You take care of that little guy." "And yourself." Ellie turned to go but paused, then reached into her pocket. She pulled out a pen and quickly scribbled something on the back of a boarding stub. "This is my number," she said, "in case you ever want your jacket back." Sawyer accepted it with a small smile and a raised brow. "I mean it," she added, backing away slowly. "I'm not keeping it forever." "I won't hold you to it," he replied. But as she disappeared into the terminal, Sawyer had the distinct feeling that this wasn't the end of it. He looked down at the slip of paper. The ink had smudged slightly from her fingers, probably from the bottle of water or the baby's grip, but the number was still legible. And beneath it, in rushed handwriting, she'd written 3 words: "Thanks for seeing me." Sawyer stood for a moment in the quiet corridor, Maggie at his side. Then he folded the note and tucked it into his wallet. He didn't know what would come of it, but somehow, for the first time in a long while, he was curious. The Denver terminal was busy, but not chaotic, the kind of quiet buzz that belonged to early afternoon flights and winter coats. Sawyer and Maggie walked shoulder to shoulder toward the baggage claim, neither in a hurry, neither ready to say what they were both thinking. "She'll keep the jacket," Maggie said finally, her tone matter-of-fact. Sawyer raised a brow. "Think so I would." He chuckled. "Fair enough." But Maggie wasn't smiling. She looked up at him, face serious. "She's sad, like you were." Sawyer didn't answer. There wasn't much to say to that. Kids like Maggie saw more than adults wanted to admit, and carried it quietly the way children do when they're trying to protect the grown-ups they love. "Maybe she's lonely," Maggie added, her voice softer. Sawyer glanced down at her, brushing a hand over her shoulder. "She's got her baby." "So did you," Maggie whispered. That stopped him. He crouched slightly eye level with her now. "Hey, I'm not lonely when I'm with you," I know, Maggie said. "But you were." Sawyer felt something tighten in his chest. Not pain exactly, but that old familiar pull of truth when it came from a child's mouth. The kind you couldn't argue with. He gave her a small, quiet nod. "Yeah, I was." They stood in silence for a moment longer, surrounded by the whirl of travelers and the sound of rolling suitcases. Then Maggie slipped her hand into his and tugged gently. "Let's go get our bags." Across the terminal, Ellie shifted her son on her hip and stepped into the family restroom, the door closing with a soft click. She was exhausted in the way that reached beyond the body and settled deep in the spirit. The baby stirred in her arms, fussy and restless now that the movement had stopped. She lowered him onto the changing table, speaking softly to soothe him. "Almost done, little man. Just a new diaper, then we'll find Nana." "Okay." He kicked his legs, letting out a frustrated squeal. Ellie smiled despite herself. "You get that attitude from your father, I swear." Her voice caught in her throat. She looked away quickly, focusing on the wipes and clean diaper, keeping her hands busy to quiet the ache rising inside her. When she reached into the diaper bag, her fingers brushed something soft, not a blanket or toy, but fabric she didn't recognize at first. She pulled it out. The jacket. Sawyer's jacket. She must have stuffed it in the bag absent-mindedly as they were leaving the plane, too tired to think. She held it now, pressed to her chest like something sacred. And that's when she noticed the pocket was unzipped. Curious, she slid her hand inside. Her fingers closed around something small and folded. She pulled it out. It was a piece of lined paper, torn from a child's notebook, the edges frayed, folded into quarters, the creases worn soft. Ellie unfolded it carefully. In faint pencil, a little smudged from fingers, and time was a child's handwriting. "My daddy helps people. Always. He's my hero. Maggie." There was a small drawing beneath it, a stick figure with a big smile holding hands with a little girl. The figure wore a square-shaped coat and boots. Ellie stared at the note for a long time. She didn't cry, not right away. The kind of ache this note carried didn't demand tears. It demanded silence. Reverence. A kind of stillness that came when something buried inside you began to thaw. Someone saw him, she thought. Not just a man in pain. Not just a tired, single dad. A hero. She folded the paper, slowly pressing her fingers to her lips. "I have to find him," she whispered. The baby let out a coo, reaching toward the jacket like it meant something to him, too. Ellie kissed the top of his head. "We will, sweetheart. I promise." Sawyer didn't notice the missing paper until later that night. After they checked into the small rental apartment near the clinic, after Maggie fell asleep, curled beside him on the couch, after he finally sat down with a cup of reheated coffee and pulled out his wallet to reread the boarding pass Ellie had written her number on. It was there, of course. Her number still smudged, her handwriting unmistakable. But something felt off. He reached for the jacket. Not his. He forgot she'd taken it. He smiled at the thought, the way she'd looked over her shoulder, the way she said she'd return it eventually. Sawyer chuckled. He didn't care if she did. And yet, he hoped. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. Snow flurried lightly under the orange glow of the lamplight. There was something in the air that night, a kind of hush, as if the world were pausing, listening, waiting. Somewhere out there, a woman carried his jacket, and a baby clutched Bucky the deer, and maybe, just maybe, someone was reading a note written in a child's hand, a note Sawyer had never meant anyone to find, a note Maggie must have slipped in when he wasn't looking. He shook his head slowly. "Peanut butter," he whispered to himself. "It sticks." The snow had picked up by the time Ellie left the airport, fine flurries dancing like whispers around the windshield. Her mother had picked her up at the curb the way she always did, with a too-tight hug and a warm thermos of mint tea. "You look pale," her mother said, as she helped Ellie buckle the baby's car seat. "And tired." "I am both," Ellie replied. They didn't talk much on the drive. Her mother had learned not to push. Ellie appreciated that, though she didn't say it. The baby slept most of the way, the cloth deer clutched to his chest like a security badge. When they pulled into the long, winding driveway of the family estate, a modest mansion now mostly used for company retreats, Ellie felt a familiar tightness return to her chest. She hadn't been back in months, not since the funeral. Her father's study had been left untouched. She hadn't dared go in. Until now. That night, after the baby was asleep in the nursery, and her mother had retired with a novel and a heating pad, Ellie stood alone in the dim hallway outside the study. She held the folded paper from Maggie in one hand and Sawyer's jacket in the other. The door creaked open with the weight of memory. The room smelled exactly the same pipe tobacco, old leather, and something else she couldn't name, something she had long associated with safety. With her father. The desk stood as it always had, massive and carved, facing the large windows that looked out over the snow-covered grounds. Her father had believed a good leader should always face the horizon. Ellie walked slowly to the desk and sat. She hadn't meant to open the drawer, not really, but her fingers found the brass handle like they had muscle memory, and the top drawer slid open with a soft sigh. Inside, on top of some old documents, lay an envelope. Her name was on the front, written in her father's familiar, deliberate hand. She stared at it for a long time. Then carefully she opened it. "Ellie, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and for that I'm sorry. I had hoped to tell you all this in person. But sometimes life doesn't give us the time we think it will. There's something I need you to understand before you decide what to do with what I've built. This company, this airline, it's not just business. It was never just routes and planes and revenue reports to me. It was people. It was the woman on standby who got home in time for her father's last breath, the soldier who hadn't seen his baby girl crawl yet, the elderly couple who met at Gate C 20 years ago and still fly every month to celebrate. It was the quiet rows where no one looks, but kindness still happens. I built this airline to connect people, not just destinations. Hearts. If you want to run it, don't start with the corner office. Start in the back row. See who still believes in goodness when no one's watching. If you find someone back there, someone who still helps without asking who gives, when he has little, you'll know. You'll know what this legacy is really worth. Love, Dad." By the time she finished reading, Ellie's hands were shaking. She sat there in the silence of the study, the letter pressed to her heart, tears streaming freely, not from grief this time, but from recognition, from clarity. She reached for the jacket, and for the first time noticed something else, a faded name tag inside the collar. S. Langley. Sawyer. She whispered the name aloud, as if testing it for weight, for truth. This man, the one who helped her without knowing who she was, who knelt in a cramped airplane row and massaged a cramp from her leg, like it was nothing, who handed over his daughter's beloved toy. Without hesitation, this man was exactly who her father had written about. Not a CEO, not a strategist, a quiet hero. And somehow Maggie had seen it all along. Ellie refolded the paper and tucked it back inside the jacket. Then she picked up the phone. She didn't need a company database to find him. She had something better. A school name, a teacher's name, Ms. Janice, and the belief that if someone could raise a daughter who saw her father as a hero, then he wasn't just someone worth finding. He was someone worth knowing. Far across the city, Sawyer stood at the kitchen sink of the rental apartment, scrubbing out a mug with slow, absent-minded circles. Maggie was asleep again, tucked under 2 blankets with a paperback open on her chest. He'd been quiet all evening, more so than usual. Something about the jacket, the note, the way Ellie had written thanks for seeing me. He didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but it stayed with him. As he rinsed the mug and set it upside down on the counter, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then picked it up. Hello. There was a pause, a breath. Then a voice, soft, familiar, and steady. Sawyer, he blinked. Yes, this is Ellie. Sawyer wasn't sure how long he stood in the kitchen holding the phone. The voice had been soft, but unmistakable Ellie. Not a text, not a voicemail, not a polite thank you email with too many exclamation marks. A real voice on the line, reaching back. Maggie left a note she had said. In your jacket. I found it. He'd closed his eyes then, instinctively. Embarrassed somehow, even though he hadn't known. Even though he hadn't written it. I didn't mean to snoop, Ellie continued, her voice careful. It just slipped into my hand. And I read it. And I couldn't put it down. He cleared his throat. It sounds like her. She sees you, Ellie said. Clearly. There had been a pause. Not heavy, just full. I wanted to thank her, Ellie added. But I think I needed to thank you first. Now, hours later, the line was long gone. But her voice remained like the scent of pine in an old coat. Like the warmth that lingers on your shoulder long after someone has leaned against you. The next morning, Maggie found him sitting at the small dining table, turning a folded piece of paper over in his hands. She slid into the chair across from him, still in her pajamas, her hair sticking up on one side. You look like a man with thoughts, she said. Sawyer smiled. Maybe I do. What are they about? He handed her the paper. She unfolded it slowly, then blinked. You kept it. I found out someone else read it, too. Maggie tilted her head. Who? The lady on the plane. Ellie. Her eyes lit up. She read my note. She did. She said it made her want to call. Maggie grinned. Not the silly, toothy kind, but the kind that only shows up when something makes sense deep down. Good. Sawyer raised a brow. Good. Maggie shrugged. She was sad. I wanted her to know you help people, not just me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. That's a pretty big thing to write for such a small piece of paper. Maggie smiled again, wider this time. You always say the best things don't take up space. They make it. Sawyer stared at her, humbled by the simplicity of her wisdom, and reminded once again that he wasn't raising a child. He was learning from one. Across town, Ellie stood in the boardroom of a building that bore her family name. She hated boardrooms. They smelled like recirculated air and ambition. But this one felt different now, because her father's letter had changed everything. And so had the note from a girl who barely spoke a dozen words, but somehow told the truth in fewer. At the head of the long oak table sat an older man in a navy suit. Peter Langford, the company's acting president, had been her father's right hand for 20 years. You wanted to see me, he asked, glancing over the rim of his glasses. Ellie nodded. I've decided. About my role, the future of Montrose. Peter sat back, slowly studying her. I won't be stepping into the executive chair, she said. Not yet. Peter raised a brow. You're the majority shareholder, Ellie. You don't need anyone's permission. I'm not asking, she said evenly. I'm just letting you know I'm not here to run numbers and hold meetings. Not until I've done what my father asked. Peter blinked, which is to sit in the back row. Literally. He stared at her puzzled. I'm going to fly. Unlisted, random routes. No press, no attention. Just passengers. I want to see what happens when no one knows I'm watching. Peter leaned forward. You think your father meant that literally? I think my father believed in people. And I think I found someone who made me believe again, too. She didn't mention Sawyer by name, but she thought of him, of his steady hands, his quiet strength, the way he didn't flinch when things got messy. He had held her calf while she breathed through pain. He had given her his jacket and said nothing more about it. He had trusted a complete stranger with his daughter's favorite toy. That kind of person didn't just exist. They mattered, and they reminded you why you wanted to show up in the first place. Peter didn't interrupt her thoughts. He just nodded. I think your father would approve. I hope so, Ellie said. Because this isn't a press move or a legacy grab. I want to know that what he built still means something. And if it doesn't, Peter asked softly. Ellie looked out the window toward the snowy runway beyond. Then I'll start over, from the back row. That afternoon, Ellie sat on the nursery floor folding laundry, while her son babbled beside her. Bucky Maggie's deer had become his favorite. He refused to nap without it now. Ellie looked at him at the small tuft of blonde hair curling above his forehead and whispered, You met a good man, little one, and you don't even know it yet. She glanced over at her phone. No new messages, just the number she had already saved, under a name that wasn't quite true. Sawyer Langley Quiet Row. She tapped the screen, hesitated, then put it down. Some moments didn't need a second call. Some moments needed space. Let the next step come when it was meant to. And something told her it would. The knock came just as the snow began to fall again. Sawyer looked up from the sink, the dish towel still in his hand. He wasn't expecting anyone not here, not in this short-term rental 2 blocks from the clinic. Most people didn't knock these days anyway. They texted. But this knock wasn't the kind that came from a delivery driver. It wasn't rushed or impersonal. It was intentional. He stepped quietly toward the door, glanced through the peephole, and froze. Ellie stood on the porch, a soft blue coat wrapped around her shoulders, her hair slightly damp at the ends from snow, and in her arms bundled tightly was her baby and Sawyer's jacket. He opened the door slowly. She smiled, small, tentative. Hi. For a moment he couldn't find his voice. Hey, he managed. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, he said, stepping aside instinctively. Come in. It's freezing. She moved inside with quiet care, her boots leaving light prints on the mat. Her baby blinked at the warmth, his tiny hands reaching for the air like it belonged to him. I didn't know where else to go, Ellie said. I mean, I did. But I didn't want to call. I just needed to come. Sawyer nodded, still trying to catch up. I didn't expect to see you again this soon. She looked at him. Neither did I. He led her to the couch where she sat carefully, her baby resting in the crook of her arm. Maggie peeked around the corner from the hallway, her eyes going wide. Is that? She whispered. Sawyer nodded. It is. Maggie ran forward, eyes locked on the cloth deer in the baby's hand. He still has. Bucky Ellie laughed, not a tired one this time, but a real, bright sound. He sleeps with it every night. The boy giggled, delighted by Maggie's attention, waving the deer in the air. Can I hold him? Maggie asked. Sawyer raised an eyebrow. Ellie smiled. Sure, if your dad's okay with it. I think she's earned it, Sawyer said, and Maggie sat beside Ellie, arms ready. Ellie gently passed the baby over, guiding Maggie's arms, until the boy settled, cooing happily. The two children, one speaking in giggles, the other in calm, seemed to fall into rhythm as if they'd done this before. Sawyer sat across from Ellie, the jacket now folded on her lap. "I brought this back," she said. "You didn't have to." "I know," she replied, "but it didn't feel right keeping it." He looked at the jacket, then at her. "Did you find the note before or after you decided to call before?" she said. "But it was the note that made me realize I couldn't not call." He nodded slowly. "It's funny. I didn't even know she put it there." "She didn't have to ask," Ellie said. "Kids never do when the truth is that simple." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Maggie bounce the baby gently on her knees, the cloth deer bouncing with them. Then Ellie looked back at him, her voice quieter now. "You're the first person in a long time who didn't treat me like someone fragile, or someone to tiptoe around." Sawyer's jaw shifted, but he didn't interrupt. "You just saw me," she said. And that meant something. A lot, actually. "I didn't do much," he said. "You gave your coat, and your daughter's toy. You massaged a leg cramp like you've done it 100 times. "I have," he said. "And I didn't expect anything in return." "I know," Ellie said. "That's the part that scared me." He looked up. "I haven't trusted someone in a long time," she added. "Not even family. But sitting next to you. It was the first time in months I didn't feel like I was falling apart." Sawyer leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Then maybe that row wasn't so quiet after all. Ellie smiled again, a little sadder now. "I came here to return a jacket. But mostly, to see if what I felt on that plane was real." And she looked at him with eyes that had known sorrow and survival. It was. Sawyer nodded, slow and sure. "Then maybe you didn't just miss a flight that day." "No," she whispered. "Maybe I boarded the right one." The snow outside thickened, painting the windows in soft white haze. Inside, warmth filled the space, not just from the heater or the mug of tea Sawyer offered Ellie next, but from something deeper, unspoken, a kind of peace that hadn't lived in either of them for a long time. Sawyer stood and retrieved something from a nearby side table. It was the boarding pass stub she'd written her number on. He held it out to her. She took it, brows raised. "Why do you still have this?" "Because I wasn't ready to call," he said, "but I couldn't throw it away either." Ellie folded the paper and slipped it into her purse. Neither could I. Maggie looked up from the couch. "Are you staying for dinner?" Ellie hesitated. The baby, still in Maggie's arms, let out a happy squeal. "I guess we are," she said softly. "If you'll have us." Sawyer didn't speak for a beat. He simply walked toward the kitchen and said over his shoulder, "Hope you like grilled cheese." Ellie laughed. "You're serious." "Dead serious," he said. "But I make it with real butter. None of that margarine nonsense." From the living room came the delighted giggles of two children, and in that small rented apartment beneath the falling snow and between two beating hearts that had almost stopped believing, a quiet row began to feel a lot like home. The invitation came in a simple white envelope. Sawyer found it slipped beneath the door of the apartment 2 days after Ellie had brought back the jacket. No return address, no flashy font, just his name written in clean blue ink. Maggie had been the one to spot it first. "What's this?" she asked, handing it over like it was a treasure map. Sawyer opened it slowly, already half expecting the handwriting to match the stub in his wallet. It did. Inside was a single card. "You helped me breathe. Now I want the world to know why people like you matter. Would you come, Ellie Sky, Kindness Launch Event, Thursday, 6:30 p.m., Montrose Air Headquarters." Sawyer stared at the card, the edges pressing into his fingers like questions. Maggie peered over his arm. "Are we going?" He hesitated. "It's not really my scene." "She invited you, Dad. Not some guy in a suit. You." He looked at her, then back at the card. Maybe just this once it was time to say yes. The headquarters of Montrose Air stood like a glass and steel lighthouse on the edge of the city, overlooking both runway and horizon. Sawyer had driven past it once before, years ago, and never imagined he'd step foot inside. But now, here he was. Wearing the same jacket Ellie had tried to return, Maggie at his side in her best dress, holding Bucky the deer like a guest of honor. A receptionist greeted them with a warm smile and led them into a private hall. Low lights, soft jazz playing in the background. On the walls were framed photos of flight attendants, pilots, mechanics, and even passengers, all caught in quiet moments of kindness. One helping an elderly man stow a bag, another comforting a crying child, a pilot kneeling beside a nervous teenager, showing her how to breathe before takeoff. Above the final photo hung the words, "It's not the seat that matters. It's the heart that fills it." Sawyer paused, reading it twice. Dad, Maggie whispered, pointing ahead. At the center of the hall stood Ellie, radiant but simple, not in a designer gown, but a soft blue dress that matched the sky behind her. She wasn't surrounded by assistants or press. She stood alone, just like she had in the quiet row. When she saw them, she smiled that small, honest smile that said, "Thank you for coming without words." "I wasn't sure you'd say yes," she admitted as they approached. "Neither was I," Sawyer replied. "But Maggie reminded me I've never regretted showing up when it mattered." Ellie's eyes shimmered. "It matters tonight." She knelt beside Maggie, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead. "Thank you, too. Bucky's become royalty in our house." Maggie beamed. He always wanted to fly. A light laugh passed between them. And then, from behind a small curtain at the far end of the hall, a man with a clipboard gave Ellie a nod. "You're up." She looked at Sawyer. "Will you stay?" He didn't hesitate. "We're not going anywhere." The room beyond opened into a modest auditorium, not full of cameras, but full of people. Employees, community leaders, a few reporters from local stations, and families from the airline's hardship support fund. Ellie stepped to the podium. No notes, no teleprompter, just a folded piece of paper in her hand, torn, faded, clearly written by a child. She held it up. "This is the note that changed my life," she began. Sawyer's breath caught. Maggie Langley wrote it. She gave it to her dad, not to hand out, not for attention, but just to carry. Because she believes something we've all forgotten, that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they just sit beside you when you're scared. A soft murmur moved through the crowd. I met Sawyer Langley on a flight where I didn't feel strong. I was pregnant, exhausted in pain, and traveling alone. And this man who didn't know me helped without question. Quietly, gently, completely. She looked directly at him. He didn't do it because I was anyone important. In fact, he didn't even know my name. But he saw me, and he helped anyway. She unfolded the paper. "My daddy helps people. Always. He's my hero." Ellie smiled. I believe her. The room fell still. Then slowly applause began, gentle at first, then rising. Not loud, but deep, real. Sawyer's cheeks flushed, and Maggie grabbed his hand, beaming up at him like she'd known this moment would come all along. Ellie stepped away from the podium, making her way down the aisle toward them. "Thank you," she said again when she reached him. Sawyer shook his head. "I didn't do anything special." She looked at him, eyes steady. That's exactly why it was. After the event, as people mingled and music resumed, Sawyer and Ellie stood near a tall window, watching the runways beyond. The snow had stopped. The sky was clear again. "It's strange," he said, "how one quiet row can echo this far." Ellie nodded. "Maybe that's the only kind of echo that lasts." Maggie tugged Ellie's hand. "Yes, sweet girl, Ellie asked. Maggie pointed to an empty row of seats near the window, the kind used in airport lounges. Can we sit over there? Ellie looked at Sawyer. He smiled. I think it's a seat worth sharing. They walked together, the three of them, four, if you counted Bucky, and sat in a quiet row once more. Not on a plane, not in the air, but still somehow, exactly where they were meant to be. The snow had returned by the time Sawyer stepped out of the Montrose building that night. It came in soft, deliberate flakes, the kind that didn't rush to the ground, but took their time swirling in the glow of street lamps, like they knew exactly how to fall. He zipped up his coat, the one Ellie had returned, and turned toward the parking lot where his truck, weighted headlights faintly fogged over. Maggie walked beside him, hand tucked in as her steps, slow but certain. Did you like it? She asked. The event. She nodded. He looked up at the sky. Yeah, I did. Maggie glanced at him sideways, reading the lines in his face. You looked nervous. I was. But you didn't look away. Sawyer smiled. I told you I don't do that anymore. Maggie gave a satisfied nod as if confirming something only she had been watching for. They reached the truck. Sawyer opened the passenger side for her and helped her climb in. Before he shut the door, he paused. Do you want to go straight back to the apartment? Maggie shrugged. I don't mind. But. She looked down at her mittened hands. I liked being with them. Ellie and the baby. Sawyer exhaled slowly, watching his breath cloud. Me too. He shut the door gently. Ellie stood inside the building lobby watching from the window as Sawyer helped Maggie into the truck. She hadn't meant to linger, but she couldn't quite leave either. The sight of them, father and daughter so close-knit and calm, felt like watching a favorite song come to life. One she hadn't known the lyrics to, but somehow recognized the melody. Behind her, Peter Langford approached with 2 paper cups. Hot cocoa, he offered. No judgment if you take both. Ellie smiled and accepted one. Thanks. He stood beside her, looking out at the snow. You did well tonight. I didn't plan to say any of that. That's why it worked. Ellie sipped the cocoa, then asked, What do you know about him? Langley. Peter shrugged. Not much. I ran a background check after your call just to be sure. Military record. Medical discharge. Clean history. Raised in Montana. Lost his wife in a car accident 2 years ago. Sounds like more than not much. Peter smiled. I said I didn't know him. Doesn't mean I didn't read. Ellie glanced back out the window. He's different. Because he helped you. No, she said. Because he helped me before knowing I needed it. Before knowing who I was. Peter didn't speak. He didn't need to. He didn't ask questions, Ellie added. He just saw something. And he stepped in. Like it was nothing. Kindness rarely announces itself, Peter said. Ellie nodded. But it always lands. Back at the apartment, Maggie curled up on the couch with a blanket and a book. The baby, now lovingly referred to by both children as Captain Bucky, had been fed, changed, and tucked into a borrowed crib that Sawyer had dug out from a storage closet. Ellie stood in the doorway of the tiny kitchen, watching as Sawyer poured water into the kettle. This feels strangely domestic, she said. He looked up. Too much. No, she smiled. Not enough. He turned back to the counter, but the silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was warm, companionable. She stepped closer. I didn't expect tonight to feel like this. Me neither, he admitted. I figured I'd shake a few hands, take a photo, sneak out before the dessert tray. You were the dessert tray, she said. He chuckled. And here, I thought I was just the guy in the back row. Ellie was quiet a beat. Then, with the softest breath, she said, I didn't want it to end. Sawyer turned toward her. His voice was even. Then don't let it. She blinked, not because she hadn't thought it, but because she hadn't expected him to say it. "Are you asking me to stay? I'm not asking anything," he said. "But if you're wondering whether there's space for you here, you already know the answer." Ellie's throat tightened. She looked over at Maggie, now dozing under the blanket, the book sliding from her hands. Then at the crib in the corner, the baby asleep, one arm splayed across Bucky's back. This wasn't romance. Not yet. It was something deeper. It was trust. "I don't have much packed," she said finally. Sawyer stepped aside, gesturing toward the empty half of the tiny coat rack. "I travel light too." Ellie smiled. "Then maybe I'll stay a few days." He met her gaze. "Stay as long as you need." Later that night, after the kettle had cooled and the apartment had gone quiet, Sawyer sat on the floor beside Maggie's bed. She was asleep, her breathing soft and even. He whispered, "You okay with all this?" She stirred slightly but didn't open her eyes. "She needs us," she murmured. Sawyer brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We might need her too." "She knows," Maggie whispered. How Maggie smiled in her sleep. She stayed. Sawyer leaned back, closing his eyes. Outside, the snow settled over rooftops and roads, blanketing the city in gentle silence. It was a winter landing, not on a runway, but in a living room, warmed by trust. Children, and something even rarer, the kind of love that doesn't announce itself but chooses to stay. The flight wasn't full. It was a short test route, Denver to Jackson Hole, a pilot run for a new regional line Montrose Air was considering. No press, no fanfare. Just a handful of employees, some training staff, and 2 special guests who chose to sit in the very back, despite being offered first class. Sawyer adjusted his seatbelt and looked out the window. The sky was unusually clear, pale blue stretching out forever edged in sunlight. Beside him, Ellie rested quietly, her baby asleep in a sling against her chest. Maggie sat on the other side, sketching little mountains and clouds in the corner of a travel brochure. Bucky balanced on her lap like a co-pilot. The hum of the engines filled the silence. But in this row 29, the quiet row, there was no need for words. It had been 3 months since that night in the apartment. 3 months of dinners with mismatched forks, bedtime stories read by alternating voices, and morning coffee passed between yawns and baby laughter. 3 months of building something that didn't need a name. It simply was. The flight attendant stopped by and smiled. "You two always choose this row." Sawyer looked at Ellie. She smiled back. "Only when we want to remember," she said. The attendant looked confused, but nodded politely and moved on. Sawyer chuckled. "We sound like ghosts." "We are in a way," Ellie replied. "Ghosts of who we were." He turned toward her, one arm resting along the back of her seat. "Do you regret any of it?" She looked at him seriously for a moment, then shook her head. "I regret every day before I met you, but not a single one since." Sawyer exhaled slowly, eyes soft. "It's strange, isn't it? All it took was a jacket and a nap. Don't forget the deer." They both looked down at Bucky, now dressed in a child-sized flight attendant vest Maggie had made from felt and safety pins. Ellie grinned. "I think he's due for a raise." As the plane began its descent, Maggie reached into her backpack and pulled out a small envelope. "What's that?" Sawyer asked. She handed it to him, smiling. "Open it when we land." He raised a brow. "Secret mission." She giggled. "Sort of." Ellie watched them with quiet amusement. "She's been working on that for a week." The plane touched down smoothly, tires humming across the tarmac. No applause, just the soft hiss of air brakes and the gentle voice of the captain thanking them for flying Montrose. Sawyer waited until the plane came to a full stop before opening the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper. He unfolded it slowly, recognizing the careful pencil strokes before he saw the words, "Dear Dad, thank you for helping people. for giving away your jacket and never asking for it back, for not walking away from her, from me, from life. You made the quiet row feel like a home, and that makes you my hero forever. Love, Maggie. His eyes burned. He blinked hard, then handed the letter to Ellie. She read it, then laid her hand gently over his. You never needed a stage, she said. You just needed someone to sit beside you. He looked at her, then at the children, hers, and his now asleep, leaning into each other like two puzzle pieces that had waited years to fit. No one would believe this story, he whispered. Ellie smiled. That's okay. It wasn't written for them. They stood and gathered their things, moving slowly toward the exit. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Sawyer paused and looked back at row 29. Empty now. Just two rumpled headrests, a folded tray table, and the faintest indentation where Bucky had rested. A simple row, nothing fancy. But it had changed everything. A few weeks later, a new plaque appeared at the back of every Montrose Air aircraft, small, subtle, etched in brushed silver. Passengers rarely noticed it, unless they were looking for something more than legroom or coffee. It read, "The Quiet Row." In honor of those who help without asking, who sit beside strangers and become family, who give not for applause, but because it's who they are. This row belongs to you. One morning in spring, Sawyer sat on a park bench near the lake, coffee in hand. Ellie sat beside him, reading aloud from a worn paperback. Maggie and the baby ran circles in the grass, chasing a red kite stitched with wings. Sawyer watched them for a long time. He didn't speak, didn't need to, because for the first time in years, his world was quiet, not empty, not aching, just quiet. And in that quiet, he was whole again. Wasn't that something? Sometimes it's not grand gestures or big speeches that stay with us. It's a quiet row, a gentle act, and a jacket shared without a word. If this story touched you, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Drop a comment below. It's always a joy to see how far kindness can travel. And if you'd like more stories that speak to the heart, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just a warm invitation to stay connected. Thank you truly for spending this time with us. Until next time, take care of each other, and never underestimate the power of simply being kind.